Maxine Greene is one of the most highly renowned educators and philosophers of the last century. As a Jewish woman in 1940s and 50s America, at a time when being Jewish and a woman held no promise for success, she became one of the most influential voices for classroom and art teachers alike. She was a philosopher, a teacher, an activist, and a highly published author. She was an engaging and inspiring public speaker that would mesmerize audiences every time she spoke. She worked in the fields of philosophy and education for most of her life. Despite her success, she never really fit in with her peers and was consistently ahead of her time. Her ideas were often overlooked or dismissed for being too radical, only to find footing with her contemporaries 10 to 15 years later. Being Jewish and a woman in a time when those identifiers were looked down upon, she had to continually fight for her voice to be heard, her ideas valued. She was a voracious reader, consuming philosophical texts, works of fiction, the daily newspaper, as well as attending theater, museums, and performances, immersing herself in aesthetic experiences which would greatly influence her educational philosophy. She constantly questioned the nature of life and experience within her existential phenomenological practice. She pursued ethics and justice and felt deeply for the treatment of others. She was most concerned with creating a just and humane community of education and fought against systems that prioritize testing over learning. Her influence will be felt for generations to come. Born Sarah Maxine Meyer in Brooklyn, New York, on December 23, 1917, to her father, Max Meyer, who was German Alsatian, and her mother, Lily Greenfield, who was of Hungarian descent. She was the oldest of 4 children. Her father grew up very poor, but worked hard to create greater financial stability for his family and operated a small family business. Maxine was Jewish, but her father had a marked dislike for practicing Orthodox Jews and Eastern Europeans, which influenced his decisions and her ongoing relationship with Judaism. Max did not continue his education past the 3rd grade, but Lily graduated from high school. Maxine would be the first to attain a college degree in her family. Max Greene sent his 4 children to an Episcopalian private school, the Berkeley School in Brooklyn, in order to assimilate them into mainstream American culture. Due to financial issues, 2 of Max's daughters and his son were withdrawn from this school and sent to a public institution, but the Berkeley School kept Maxine enrolled for diversity reasons. She was one of only 2 Jewish students at the school and was often reminded through frequent remarks and asides that she was different, but more importantly, less than. Maxine missed out on invitations to friends' homes due to their family's anti-Semitism. And her own principal told her that she would have qualified for a scholarship to Mount Holyoke if only she was not Jewish. She was denied the opportunity to speak at her high school graduation after earning the highest honor of valedictorian because the ceremony was held at a Methodist church. She often apologized for her being Jewish and accepted this reality as just how things were. To her, it was normal. It was this early exposure to prejudice and discrimination that fueled her commitment to advocating humane education and fighting for social justice. After graduating from high school, Maxine went to Barnard College at Columbia University, which she said had a better quota for Jewish girls than most. She paid her own way working part-time jobs because at the time, it was uncommon for girls to attend college. She said that no one saw the point of sending girls to college, so no one was invested in the process of her education. She studied American history and she minored in philosophy. In the summer after her junior year, Maxine traveled abroad to Europe at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. She interacted with people who were anti-fascists, young men who had volunteered to fight against Franco's army in Spain, and she fell in love with one of them. She wanted to be more involved in the anti-fascism movement, but she was so young and wasn't sure how she could be useful. While in Paris, Maxine went to the World's Fair in 1937. And excuse me. Okay. She went to the World's Fair in 1937 and at the Spanish Pavilion saw the first showing of Pablo Picasso's Guernica. She found herself feeling and becoming more militant and accepted a job working for the Loyalist embassy in France. After returning home, Maxine began making speeches for Loyalist Spain, and joined the American League Against Fascism. After she graduated from Barnard in 1938, she married a communist doctor, and communism defined her life for quite a bit. Because she could write well and she had a talent for public speaking, she was able to explain complex ideas and dense texts written by party leaders, and she was more able to connect with and initiate others. One of the first jobs she took following graduation was working for the American Labor Party, a political party primarily based out of New York State, promoting socialist ideologies and advocating for workers. She edited a newsletter and contributed articles on topics such as price control and the draft. When Maxine first went to college, she wanted to be a writer. After her first marriage ended, she attended classes in political science at the New School. While taking classes there, she wrote a paper on collective security, which her professors criticized for being too ideological. Her first novel about pre-Jeffersonian America was criticized for being too radical, for including the impact of the French Revolution, Alien and Sedition Acts, and the Democratic clubs. She would go on to publish 5 books on educational philosophy, over 100 articles, and 40 chapters in anthology texts over the next 60 years. After a year at Montclair University in New Jersey, Greene moved back to Brooklyn, remarried, and had a child. She decided to go back to school, and she wrote to several universities around New York City, looking for classes available around her parenting schedule. She ended up at New York University, taking a class on the history and philosophy of education, and that opened up a whole new world to her. After one semester, she was asked to teach classes in education, history, and philosophy. She graduated with her master's from NYU in 1949, and then with her doctorate in educational philosophy and history in 1955. It was only after receiving her PhD that it dawned on her that being a woman in the field was going to be a difficult journey. She began teaching again at NYU, but was refused a position in the philosophy of education department, where she was told she was too literary, too Deweyan, and too existentialist. Instead, she began teaching English and literature, despite never having taken any literature courses in college. The 60s were an instrumental time in shaping Maxine's beliefs, a time of great political activism and change. In 1962, she found a job at Brooklyn College in their Department of Educational Foundations. In 1963, she participated in the March on Washington to protest racial discrimination and segregation. She participated in civil rights and peace movement rallies and witnessed firsthand the student protests in New York City, as well as the first Vietnam teach-ins protesting the war. It was during this time of great political upheaval that Maxine saw the importance of moving beyond theory in order to exact real change, real progress, on behalf of American schools and communities. She started to turn to feminism after beginning to piece together the gender bias in the industry. At first, she believed her marginalization was due to anti-Semitism, and then disagreements with her existentialist philosophy and being too radical in her ideas. It took her a while to grasp that her marginalization stemmed from issues of her being a woman in what was very much a man's world. Lawrence Kremen, an influential educator responsible for shaping Teachers College at Columbia University, asked Greene to join their staff to teach a philosophy of education class. Unfortunately, the Department of Philosophy was opposed to her hiring, and the appointment ended up being to the English department instead. Maxine learned that it was because the philosophy and social science department had never hired a woman, and they were not ready to start with her. It took 6 years before she was hired in the philosophy department, even though she had been shortlisted as the next president of the Philosophy of Education Society and had been publishing articles for years in the field. In 1967, she became the first female president of the Philosophy of Education Society. In 1981, she would continue to shatter the glass ceiling by becoming the first woman to preside over the American Educational Research Association. When Maxine was finally voted into the philosophy department in 1975, it was as a new professor, despite already having earned tenure within Teachers College. She would go on working for Teachers College for the rest of her career. Maxine believed that education is a construct. It's political, subjective, and in need of reform. Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the key figures of French philosophy, existentialism, and Marxism, talked about the changing nature of reality. It is the artist who must break the already crystallized habits which make us see in the present tense those institutions and customs which are already out of date. She believed the overarching goal of education should be to empower students, to open new doors, and to really see society, not just for what it is, but for what it hopefully one day can be. In her words, I am obviously concerned about rendering our society more compassionate, more caring, less privatist, manipulative, and self-involved. During the Reagan era, there was a growing hostility towards progressivism and social activism and Reconstruction. Greene believed that cultivating imagination and creative thinking was the key to a thriving democratic society. Maxine believed in the transformative power of education, in the responsibility that we have to our futures to reform schools in order to reform society. She found flaws in the educational policies of a materialistic and capitalist society that would place so much emphasis on the business aspects of education, on one-size-fits-all approaches to pedagogy, to the multi-billion-dollar high-stakes testing industry, on judging teacher effectiveness and advocating for merit pay. She found flaws in histories that only represented singular perspectives, only telling one side of history, and ignoring the voices of those who have been marginalized. Greene was influenced by French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was best known for his influential work on perception. One of his definitions that was of import to Maxine was that of consciousness, having to do with being in the world rather than above it, perceiving and interpreting from a lived vantage point. Merleau-Ponty was a Marxist, had a great concern for the arts, and was interested in ideas of freedom. In his book, Phenomenology of Perception, he discusses the development of social consciousness by describing the relationship between townspeople and farm workers in the building of solidarity. He writes, "For class is a matter neither for observation nor degree, like the appointed order of the capitalistic system, like revolution. Before being thought, it is lived through as an obsessive presence, as possibility." Greene also believed that true freedom is found in possibility, in being able to make your own choices and to create your own sense of self. In her book, The Dialectic of Freedom, printed in 1988, she says her aim is to consider some of the predicaments and life stories of persons who could never take freedom for granted in this country: women, members of minority groups, immigrants, newcomers. She believed we have a need to engage with them, not from the greater vantage point of society or the big picture, but instead from their unique vantage points as they experience the world. This idea was very much in line with Martin Heidegger's existential phenomenology as well. Heidegger, a German philosopher, developed a theory of the authentic person who was self-defined and lived with the ever-present feelings of dread, disappearance, and the awareness of death as a consciously known inevitability. What is true for us is not true for the masses, as Plato believed. We make our own truths based on how we perceive and reflect upon our own experiences. Existentialist philosophies are anti-metaphysical, meaning that reality does not exist before we are plunked into it, but rather reality is constructed by our own perceptions and experiences. In 1971, Heidegger wrote that the arts make space for spaciousness, opening up new worlds, greater understandings, greater interactions, and experiences. These ideas would later shape Greene's philosophy of aesthetic education. We live in a visual culture where people are bombarded with images every day, everywhere. We experience the arts in different ways now through television, film, social media, where a larger audience is exposed to a greater variety of art content and themes. The increase in access has not correlated to a higher level of aesthetic sophistication, or even with greater enjoyment. Society has become more materialistic and consumerist, but at the same time, some may argue, more passive, careless, and apathetic. Currently, schools believe themselves to be preparing students to live and work in an advanced technological society, but they're falling short of the mark. What if there was a way to open up students to be more receptive to critical thinking, more observant, more able to appreciate the perceptions of others different from their own, more invested in learning, more aware of the oppressiveness of society, and more able to work towards a solution? In 1978, Greene wrote Landscapes of Learning, which marked a shift in her philosophy to the arts and aesthetic experiences. One of the biggest components of Greene's philosophy of education was what she called aesthetic education, which she defined as an intentional undertaking to nurture appreciation, reflection, participation with the arts by enabling learners to notice, to lend works of art their lives in order to make meaning. This concept of lending parts of oneself to works of art refers to the memories, experiences, and emotions of the individual that plays a big role in how they perceive work. People experience works of art not as the artist intended, but rather through a veil of their own personal backgrounds, biographies, and experiences. There are a multitude of different perspectives and interpretations during these aesthetic encounters, which reflect the pluralism of the world in which we live. Greene believed art to be a way to reach students of varying backgrounds and from different locations around the world. The role of the teacher is to enable students to interpret experiences for themselves and allow them to reflect on their role and their own cognition. The world of the arts is unique in that it is uniquely positioned to reach students, to overcome their passivity regarding their own education. Interest draws them in and helps them to discover their own meaning. The arts can help in promoting critical awareness, can enable students to look closer at text and images, to see more clearly what they wouldn't be able to see otherwise, but only when allowed to reflect on these experiences through open questioning. She called this wide awakeness. Wide awakeness is an aptitude for engagement with the world, for being fully attentive to those around us, for noticing details that one would normally not notice. These are skills which can be cultivated through aesthetic education. Art has the ability to change the way we experience life. How you engage with a poem is different from how you engage with a painting. And the goal of each is to awaken something in your unconscious that was asleep or closed off before. She believed that works of art are not to be experienced passively, but rather achieved. Aesthetics, after all, she says, involves an exploration of the questions arising when people become self-reflective about their engagements with art forms. Greene didn't just philosophize on the importance of aesthetic education. She put it into practice. She is very well read and often quotes poetry and literature in her arguments regarding education and the arts. As an advocate for aesthetic education, she uses these quotes as both influence for and evidence of her philosophy and use. When Greene writes, she often quotes literature and poetry, tying in the words of Herman Melville, Mark Twain, Albert Camus, Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison. She will use the paintings of Paul Cézanne, the music of Mozart, the movements of Alvin Ailey. As she so often uses studies of great works of literature, art, and music as ways for students to connect with and contextualize big ideas of philosophy, she also uses these references to illustrate or to draw inspiration for her own educational philosophy. Maxine believed that art has a way of sweeping away arbitrary frames and bringing you in touch with the world as you live it, and are often afraid to live it. To use works of art to encourage a reflective and authentic response to particular works is to counter the abstractness and distancing of so much philosophy. She considers this divergent thinking. As an example, she gives The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which she would read with her educational philosophy students. Using the story of a young boy without the power to combat racism in his own culture, despite his love for Jim, she looks at issues of race, of violence, of artifice, providing open-ended questions to her students as a way for them to connect the content to the writings of Tyack or Dewey or Katz. Discussing and asking questions about the arts and our aesthetic experiences and perceptions leads an openness to applying these skills to other areas. The very asking of such questions, the very exploration of ways of fostering such encounters, may well open new perspectives on what it is to learn and what it is to see. Maxine's philosophy of education was inspired and influenced by many. She says, "I am drawn to those who unconceal, who are not afraid to expose the darkness to go below the surfaces, who are capable of indignation, who are willing to join with others to make changes without any guarantee at all." Perhaps the single most quoted individual in any of her writings, John Dewey was the educational philosopher at the forefront of Greene's own philosophy, always taking his ideas one step further to ensure the inclusion of individuality and the importance of multiple perspectives on the pursuit of social justice. Greene was drawn to Dewey's work on freedom, the arts, and learning especially. He believed that education is learning to become human. He was a keen supporter of pragmatism because of his views on the scientific method being able to solve all of life's problems. Even though he was the pioneer of progressivism, Maxine didn't agree with all of Dewey's ideas and often criticized him for not being progressive enough, not being radical enough. In Democracy and Education, written in 1916, Dewey wrote about experiences being the driving force in the creation of the self. He believed that the self did not exist, but instead is created through a series of actions and interests. Maxine took this idea a step further, finding the importance of self-development being tied to gender, race, and class as well, because the self is not independent of societal factors. Dewey defined the aesthetic experience as one that existed between a person and the art object in a sort of transaction or dance. A person doesn't need to know the name of the steps to understand and feel the movement, to engage in the aesthetic experience. Maxine would apply this to her own understanding and development of aesthetic education. Greene continued to bring teachers together with practicing artists in workshops, weaving in performances, exhibitions, and art making through her work with the Lincoln Center Institute of Arts and Education, now the Lincoln Center of Education, where she served as philosopher in residence from 1976 on. Maxine would provide lectures on aesthetics, imagination, perception, and school renewal. During the school year, artists would go to schools to work with teachers to help students engage with artworks. These aesthetic experiences help them to connect with performances, with literature, with theater and dance, as they become more capable of reading gesture and finding meaning. Maxine says, "We hope that imagination is released, perception enhanced, relationships deepened. Experiences like this, I want to believe, enable persons to break with the fixed frames of the taken for granted, see alternative possibilities and experience, and sometimes I hope are moved to make transformations to bring the world in accord with a vision they have found." Maxine Greene sadly passed away on May 29th, 2014 at the age of 96. She was tireless in her pursuit of social justice and in her advocacy for the arts and aesthetic learning. Her influence will continue to be felt for decades to come. Already, we see the impact she has had on arts integration as more and more teachers add arts and aesthetic experiences into their curricula. One school, aptly named in honor of her legacy, has embedded her philosophy into their own. The Maxine Greene High School for Imaginative Inquiry in New York, whose mission statement is to infuse interdisciplinary studies with experiences in and reflective studies of the arts in order to release imagination and open up students to reach beyond themselves and to look at things as if they could be otherwise. Most importantly, they aim to encourage dialogue that will empower their diverse population as they strive for a more just, humane, and vibrant world. It isn't just at Maxine Greene High. Maxine has influenced teachers from around the world, as well as within her own community. She continues to influence university professors who lead the charge in ushering the new wave of teachers. She has influenced curriculum studies and development as districts attempt to include more activities that aren't standards-based, limiting to scope and sequence. Instead, there's a greater push to include aesthetic experiences as well as art making. We've only scratched the surface of what is possible through aesthetic education, on dreaming of what is possible, of what society could be, on Maxine's influence on the future world. Her greatest influence on education is still yet to come. She was always ahead of her time, and the hope is that we will feel that influence even stronger in the coming years. I leave you with a quote from Variations on a Blue Guitar, written in 2011 by Maxine Greene. I hope you think about the wonder of multiple perspectives in your own experience. I hope you think about what happens to you when it becomes possible to abandon one-dimensional viewing, to look from many vantage points, and in doing so, construct meanings scarcely suspected before. Our object, where young people are concerned, is to provide increasing numbers of opportunities for tapping into long unheard frequencies, for opening new perspectives on a world increasingly shared. It seems to me that we can only do so with regard for the situated lives of diverse children and respect for the differences in their experiences.